I'm Sandy, and I'm in Dallas and right now, and in Mexico City. Not right now.
I'm Michelle, and I'm in Golden, British Columbia, Canada.
I'm Dulce. I'm from Brazil, Rio de Janeiro.
And I'm Linda, and I'm in Dallas.
I'm Victor Harder. I'm from Calgary, Alberta, Canada.
I'm Didi, and I'm in Carbondale, Colorado.
Damian from Los Angeles.
Catherine, San Francisco.
Please.
Michelle from Calgary, Alberta.
Roberto Hirsch from Brazil, São Paulo.
Lynn from Williamstown, Massachusetts.
Eva Hlesh from Rio, Brazil.
Lori from Columbus, Ohio.
Sarah from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada.
Woohoo!
Monica from Italy, Rome.
From Rome.
Wow.
Yes.
Lovely. Thank you. Anybody else?
Diana from Mexico.
Excellent.
Hi, Jason from Los Angeles.
Excellent, Jason. Thank you. Anybody else? Wow. It's quite the community. It's kind of global as well as the Americas, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
And Norma. Okay, so we're going to move ahead. I'd like to welcome everyone and Eve. Eve, I first met Eve. I was organizing the first North American Coaching Supervision Forum here in Victoria about, was it 2 years ago? And I put out an ad on LinkedIn saying, who would like to donate a prize to our draw? And Eve was the first person to step in, like within an hour. It's like, I will donate hours to free supervision. Do you remember that, Eve? That was my first interaction with Eve. And since then, we've had continuous conversations about various things. And she has started this great global supervision network. There's 100 supervisors from four continents getting together on a monthly basis to for continuous development. Really great webinars. She also is part of my supervision pro bono supervisors, working in our coach activism project, which is coaching workers in the Syrian refugee movement. So very pleased to have her here. She was a senior leader in BBC, running a 250-strong journalistic division. And then she started as an internal coach at BBC. And following that, she set up her very successful practice about 10 years ago. She's a master executive coach and supervisor. She's actually one of the first 2 accredited supervisors in Europe through EMCC. She was the 2015 winner of the prestigious EMCC European Coach of the Year Award, and in 2016, she was all highly commended as well in those awards. And what else? Best Research Article awarded for Coaching at Work magazine in 2015. And she has an MSc in coaching and various postgraduate qualifications in supervision, an MBA, and also a master's in music. She's also a conductor of an orchestra, which is kind of how I see her in the world. She's conducting all this supervision work all over the world. And she's also a big researcher and writer, and she is currently editing her first book. So welcome, Eve. I'm going to let you take over. The rest of the hour is yours.
Thank you. You missed out the bit, of course, that I absolutely love football, but by that I mean European football, not American football. I just say that, which I don't understand. But there you go. Welcome everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me, Lily. And my brief is to talk about how to build a practice, which I think is it would be a bit presumptuous of me really, because I don't know the North American market. I don't know the Latin American market. Don't know what the market's like in Canada. And things will be different wherever we are. And there's a maturity in the market in the UK. So what I thought I'd do, and I've got to try and share my screen with you, is to show a little bit of some research I did relatively recently with a chap called Professor Peter Hawkins. I don't know if some of you have come across his work, but Peter Hawkins has written a lot of books on supervision. And he and I did a big project, and in fact we're supposed to be writing a book together. And one of the things we did was look at the supervision market across the world. And funny enough, I'm sure some of you will have contributed to it, but I thought it might be useful to give a bit of context before I talk about what I've done, because I think the challenge is I can't assume that what I've done will work everywhere. And I also thought there might be some encouragement. So I'm going to lose you now, because once I share my screen, I'll only see 4 of you at a time, and it's been so wonderful seeing all your faces. So feel free to jump in any time, because I won't be able to see if you're wanting to jump in. So please, is it okay to be interactive, ask questions as we go along, and because I want this to be useful to you. So with any luck, I want to share the right thing. I think this is it. If it's not, I'm going to be very embarrassed. Okay, that is the right thing. So, are you seeing, can you see? Good, I can only see Lily at the moment.
Yeah, we can see
Looks good. It's the right one.
Okay, so this is meant to be a discussion. I can't bear it when I do all the talking. So, what are my aims? So I'm going to start by sharing some research. And at the end of this presentation, which Lily has, she's very welcome to send it out to everyone. And there are some links to things that are free that you can read that back this up. So for example, the research that was done 10 years ago for something called the CIPD stands for, it's the Institute for Personnel and Development. And it was a very big piece of research that looked at where supervision was in relation to how organisations and coaches were using it. And so this research I did with Peter Hawkins built on the research nearly 10 years earlier. So then I'm going to share a little bit of the research and then share some of my experiences and the different elements that I've used. And then hopefully we'll discuss. So some of it I'm going to do a whistle-stop tour, but you'll have it all for later. So starting with the research on supervision. So this project had a lot of responses, as you can see, 717, excuse me, and 428 people completed the supervision section. So that's a pretty good amount of people to be making some generalizations from. However, it was mostly European, as you'll see. So this one I'm going to skip past, but there are some facts and figures about who was involved in the research. So what did we find? Well, first of all, there was really big growth in supervision happening. And bear in mind, this is based on some research that was very similar 10 years earlier. And the reasons for having supervision had changed, but there were geographical differences. So what we saw was that the responses from the USA and Canada were very similar to the responses that the UK had given nearly 10 years earlier. So that just suggests that this is an evolution and that it takes its time and the market does mature, but it matures over time. So it's encouraging, but sometimes you can't speed things more than they're going to go. Some organisations insist on coaches having supervision, but even in the UK, which is a relatively mature market, it wasn't consistent. And so there's an element of perhaps working on organisations that we can pick up on. Just a minor thing, coaches didn't seem to mention whether or not they were having supervision to their clients. And that was because clients were involved in this research, and nearly half didn't know if their coaches had supervision or not. And then where coaches had supervision, they were having it at least 4 times a year. So that's some overall findings. You'll have this to see. Excuse me. Now, obviously in Latin America, we only had a few responses. So 8 out of 9 people who responded in Latin America were having supervision, which of course gives a very high percentage, but it's a high percentage of a small number of people responding. In the USA and Canada, I mean, more responses, so it's probably more reliable, but you will see that the number of coaches who are having supervision was still under half. And that was the figure that was very similar. It was 44% in the UK in 2006. So you can see the similarities. And then the UK had the most mature market at 92%. Africa, well, again, it was a very small figure. Europe is more reliable because we had 93 responses. The only other thing I would say is that if anyone does research with coaches, the only coaches you can access are the ones who belong to professional bodies or belong to groups like this. They tend to be the ones who are most motivated, and therefore you can't get to the sort of coaches perhaps who never have any sort of CPD or have any sort of supervision. So there's always going to be a slight bias in any research you do because it's done through the sort of groups which will have people who are more likely to get involved in supervision or CPD. I hope that's making sense.
If I'm interrupting you because I want to clarify for people CPD, that is very well known in the UK, but not as much for people in the US. It's CPD for continuing professional development. So every time that you're talking about that, it's important that people are aware what you're talking about. Okay.
Yes.
And I do believe that there is not a high level of awareness, I think, of the importance of CPD as part of the coach's training. So I want to say
that sort of form of continuous training that we have after our initial training. And of course, when I set up the Global Supervisors Network, in a way that was a response because having done training as a supervisor, there was lots of initial training, but there was very little training once you've done your initial training. So it's a way of keeping fresh. So this just shows you how often people were having supervision of the people who responded. So you'll see that of those who are having supervision, that's where you get the 70% having it 4 times a year or more, going on the right-hand side of that chart. Stop me at any time. Now, you can see here, I know it's quite small, but on the left is Africa, but with only 8 respondents. Then the UK, then Europe, Australia and New Zealand, Latin America, Asia, and then USA and Canada. So you'll see that the smallest number of coaches who are having supervision at least 4 times a year was USA and Canada. I mean, the responses aren't huge, but it's probably reasonably indicative. Any questions? I just don't want to jump.
What that says to me is there's lots of opportunities.
And that sort of picks up on this idea that really the USA and Canada does have lots of opportunity. I think we might pick up later that one of the things, what are the things that have driven supervision in the UK and Europe? And to some extent, and I'll come back to this, it has been partly driven by professional bodies. And there is, obviously, the ICF isn't as strong in the UK and Europe as it is dominant in the USA and Canada and in Latin America. So I'll come back to that.
Before you go, may I?
You may, Eva.
So I'm wondering if these numbers do reflect the reality of Latin America, because I think there is still a huge confusion between mental coaching and supervision. And what I'm wondering is if the people who replied this did not have mental coaching in mind. And my suspicion is they did.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because I was accredited as coach supervisor in 2013. I was the first one in Latin America. So I don't know that many people who are going through supervision here. Recently, luckily, we have more supervisors coming in, but I would say from what that's empirical, okay, that in the States there's more supervision going on already than in Latin America. That's my perception. So that's why I'm wondering if there wasn't a bias there regarding possibility of mixing these two concepts.
I suppose that's possible, and that would be the same potential bias for the USA and Canada, because it would be anywhere where the ICF is quite dominant, where there is what is mental coaching and what is supervision. And there's really no way of knowing that. Obviously, with the research, there was a big definition at the start of the research about what supervision was. So one would hope that people would have read it, and then there were explanations as we went through. But I think there is genuine confusion about that anyway. I think that's right.
Okay.
So we won't really know.
Yeah. And including until 2012, ICF themselves treated both as the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes.
If I could just jump in, I would also wonder if people made the distinction between peer coaching and supervision. And sometimes, certainly in the US, maybe. And I know a lot of coaches, if I ask them if they're in supervision, they say yes, and then we get down to talking about it as peer coaching. So, don't know. So a similar kind of issue that I would raise for, I actually was surprised to see the percentage that high and had the same kind of questions that Ava did.
Yes. Well, I mean, it is interesting because people do count peer supervision, and you'll see in one of the slides where they don't pay for it, it becomes clear. So I'll go back if I can work out how to. I think this is it. I think this is it. If it isn't, as I say, I'll be embarrassed. Oh, there we are. Good. Yes. So we'll go on to the next one. Why were people having supervision? Presuming it is supervision. This had changed in the UK and Europe because they were the dominant respondents, from having to have it as a requirement to wanting to have it as part of a commitment to good practice. As you can see, that was the predominant thing that people chose, which I think is encouraging. And then I'm sorry this is so small, but you will get a copy of it. So here are some geographical differences for why coaches say they want supervision. The first block is part of my personal commitment to good practice. The blue line is the UK, the orange line is Europe, and the grey line is the USA and Canada. So part of my commitment to good practice, you can see it's jumped up. This is roughly where it would have been in the UK nearly 10 years earlier, the grey line. So again, for the next one, it contributes to my continuing professional development. Blue, the UK, Europe, orange, grey is USA and Canada. Then it's a requirement of a professional body of which I'm a member. People doing it much less as a requirement. The next one, it's a requirement for accreditation or credentialing by a professional body. Again, much lower figures. The next one, it's a requirement of an organisation using me. And you can see how little that really impacts on reasons for having supervision, which in itself is interesting. It's a requirement of organisations using me as an internal coach. And internal coaching in the UK and Europe is growing a lot. I don't know what it's like in the USA and Canada, but internal coaching and team coaching seem to be the big growth areas in most of the research I've seen. And that includes things like, not Sherpa, but there's another one that's been done, a big one. And then this final one is simply people who said it wasn't applicable. That might have been because they weren't having supervision, so it wasn't applicable. This one is about payment. So this very, very thin dark blue line at the top is people who are paying more than £300. Well, when I did this, the pound has gone down a lot against the dollar since I did this, but £300 now would be $375 an hour. And then this one, paying for supervision between 200 and 300 pounds, so that's 250 to $375. And then the majority one was people paying between $125 and $250, this green section. And then people paying less than $125. And then this small one here is people who charge their supervisees the same rate as the supervisees charge their clients, which is, by the way, what I do. So sometimes I get paid a lot and sometimes I get paid hardly anything, depending on the sector people are supervising coaches from. And then this big one here, the one that's 33.4%, so, you know, it's a third of people. They don't pay for supervision, they're using a peer arrangement. So that's a third of all the people who have said they're having supervision. So that does pick up on the point that was mentioned earlier, a lot of people having peer arrangements. And the orange one next to it is people who are having some paid, but some peer. And you can see that that's over half. Is it 33% and 19%? Yeah. So does pick up on what Eva was saying earlier. This is interesting because one of the ways I think that as supervisors we can push supervision is through organisations. And Peter Hawkins, when he did his research with a gentleman called Gil Schwenk, they both work in the Basque Consultancy Group, they were really encouraging organisations, and it's worth reading their research. They were encouraging organisations to be more demanding of supervision for the coaches they used, whether they were internal or external. But this gives you an idea that even though they were saying that 10 years ago, it's organisations may want people to have supervision, but they're not insisting they have supervision. And I think that's very relevant. So they want it, the top two, but then when you say, would you only use coaches who had supervision, that was only just over a third. And then would you require and also ask for a supervisor's reference, a very low figure. And then also a relatively low figure of, would you get people to say how they use supervision with examples from their practice. So it just gives you some possibilities of things you might be encouraging organisations to do as part of good practice. I hope that makes sense. Okay. So growth areas. Well, lots of growth for North America, but is there extrinsic requirements? And that's organisations. I think there's some work that can be done there. And they're just some broad findings. So now let me just stop sharing for a moment. Are there any questions about that before I launch into ideas from it? Have I bamboozled you all?
This is Michelle. Hi. I'm just in hearing. Thanks, Eve. It was great to hear your presentation so far. I'm hearing this extrinsic requirement for supervision being stated, and I'm not sure if that's the right way to go. I mean, I think that's part of it. That's part of the story, and but we know as supervisors what value we get from supervision. And I see an opportunity of actually stating more of that on that side, more the intrinsic value of supervision, or at least the stated value of it intrinsically from what people are getting from it, because it could feel like a heavy hand if it's only from the outside only. Yeah, so I just was noticing that. Just wanted to state that.
I love that. I think if Peter was listening, I always imagine Peter because I do a lot of work with Peter Hawkins, and he'd say it's not the either or, is it? There's just something about having organisations talking more about it and requiring it more. Then there's something about sharing those wonderful benefits. There's something about the sort of work Lily's been doing, which is just giving demos of it with anyone who will have a demo in their local branch. There are just so many ways to come at this, aren't there? And I don't think there is one. And I'm sure as a group and an amazing network, I mean, God, there's so many of you on this call, it's just wonderful, is to creatively brainstorm all the possibilities.
Yeah.
Because there are lots of possibilities.
Thank you.
Well, and I hear that piece too, Michelle. And with our coach activism, which is our pro bono work with the Syrian refugee movement, we actually required the coaches that were doing the pro bono work to be part of the supervision. And in the end, they loved it. That was probably, I would imagine, the highlight of the whole program. Wow. So coming in as a requirement, but going out as a convert was a really powerful demonstration of how extrinsic can sometimes work.
Yeah. Interesting. Thank you.
I'll go back to the second part. And this is where I'm just being honest, what have I got to share with you, in a sense that I'm in a different part of the world where we're certainly a few years ahead in terms of where supervision seems to have got to. So I was thinking, what's the first thing? And it's actually, and I put listening first and talking second, because there's just something about when I go into organisations, listening to what they say. And so one of the things I remember doing very early on when I talked to organisations was encouraging them not to use me in any capacity, but to talk about what are the ways that you can ensure quality for your organisation and best value. And so I would say things like, well, I think you need to know that they've trained. I think you need to know that they carry on having continuous development. I think you probably want them to be a member of a professional body, so you know that they are working to a code of ethics. And I think you need to know they're having supervision so that they're working with somebody to ensure they're practicing as well as they can and that they don't have blind spots. So I just used to, and I feel I'm still like that. It's like a broken record. I say the same things. I never say use me, but I will say those sort of messages. And so listening first to what they need and then just trying to work it into what they need. And I think engaging with organisations has been a really important part of the work I do. So I think of an organisation that now uses me as an internal supervisor. And that took years, but I kept coming up with the same messages. And it was about, how do we add value? And so they would have all these bits of coaching going on. Oh, now I get it, Lily. But no one was conducting the orchestra. No one was bringing it all together. But I never thought that at the time. Thank you. And so I would say, how do we add value to an organisation? And so one of the things was this last bullet here. You can add value through bringing together coaches and doing supervision and bringing out themes that can be fed back to the organisation, but not by identifying individuals. And that's something a supervisor can do that the organisation often can't do for reasons of confidentiality. And obviously that comes with things like triple loop learning, how you maintain standards. But I think selling to organisations that concept of the added value that supervision brings and bringing coaches together brings is something that they really get. And that's been a very successful way of engaging with organisations because it's giving them something extra. And then the other way, which I've talked about before, is suggesting to organisations that there are some core things they can do to ensure quality and high standards for the coaches that they're using. And that's training, professional development, asking them about best practice, requesting accreditation or credentialing, and mentioning reflective practice supervision. I think in North America and Canada, what you call it might be important. So I know that there are some people who will very clearly say it's supervision. I think, Pat, you do that. And so not saying it's supervision and suggesting it's like a manager, but just having a vision of what's going on overall. So I think I've probably done a lot of work in this area, and over time it's paid dividends, but sometimes it takes time. Engaging with professional bodies. And I do think, having listened to people like Damien, that the ICF is much more open to supervision now. And I know Peter Hawkins has been doing some work and some presentations at the ICF. Or you can join other bodies. And I think one of the things that strikes me about what you're having to do in North America, Canada, and in Latin America is differentiate it from mental coaching. I completely understand that. Can I just check, does anyone want to say anything or ask any questions about that?
Yeah, my sense is in the UK, correct me if I'm wrong, is that mentoring and coaching are more closely linked than it seems to be in North America.
That's really interesting, Lily, because one of the first books I read about mentoring started off making that exact point. I think it was David Clutterbuck, and he said that in the UK it is much more closely aligned. When people are trained as mentors, it's using coaching skills, and the difference will really be about their expertise and their background.
No, there is the difference around that too, Eve, is that the concept and the distinction of mentoring as a profession is much more developed in the UK than in the rest of the world. So when we're talking about mentoring with the ICF definition, it's a little bit different than mentoring as it's used as a profession in the UK and in Europe by the European Mentor and Coaching Association, council, where there is mentoring and coaching as two different professional activities. And the difference in mentor coaching is more specific with the influence of the International Coach Federation that define mentor coaching as providing feedback for people on their coaching skills specifically in relationship with the competency model, that is the ICF core competency model, where people receive feedback about that. So I do believe that that's the reason why in the United States or Latin America there is more confusion about the two.
And I had a recent experience with this when I approached a state chapter board about coaching or supervising their board members. And every single one of them wanted me to distinguish for them the difference between mentor coaching and supervision and what that would mean to their credentialing.
So it's either there is a lot of work that we need to do even in North America, not only in bringing awareness about what is coaching supervision, and then differentiating from mentor coaching or mentoring or other practices. So I think that is what is ahead for us, to be sure that we are effective in articulating what coaching supervision is and how it works. And even I think that's sometimes the challenge for many coaches worldwide, and my experience as ICF president meeting coaches worldwide is that many times coaches have difficulties in even explaining what is coaching. So like going to coaching supervision, it's even more complicated.
And the way we addressed that years ago was to do a demo, was to give them a sample. And I think the same thing will work in supervision, because words can only capture the concept after they've had an experience.
I agree with that. And I also have noted that there are some coaching schools that I've talked with coaches that said, oh, I've had lots of supervision. And when you dig deep into what that meant, it was really mentor coaching on the ICF core competencies. And it's called supervision in their schools. So that adds to the confusion as well.
Yeah, and exactly, that's why I had raised that point. And just for you to know what kind of confusion goes on here in Brazil, we have someone who owns a training program. She created a mentor supervision course. It's called mentor supervision, and it did get a CCEU certificate from ICF, and it's only mentoring or coaching the coaching. She has not been trained as a supervisor, yet ICF did grant that. So it adds to the confusion. And why am I bringing this here? Because I think our work also with ICF should go on, because that's not helping at all when we want to make a distinction here. And ICF accredits, not accredits, but provides a stamp to say it's the same thing.
Well, I think one of the difficulties is that there are schools that do that, and they do it as a continuation of the kind of supervision that goes on during training, which is more for it's still normative. They did formative while they were in the schools, and there's this normative piece that's happening, but it's not reflective. And that's the piece that I think is really missing from the discussion, especially for experienced coaches. They don't understand yet the value of reflective practice. And so that, again, is something that the language that we want to keep in this discussion.
Maybe also I'm building on what you're saying about demonstrations. It might be valuable perhaps for some of the global networks or some of these governing bodies to actually demo and teach, instead of teaching and sharing knowledge about the profession and the latest, what's going on, is to actually teach how to do a great demo, and to, so that we're practicing demonstration in supervision, in some of our associations, supervision associations. So we get a sense of that. So we as supervisors can do more of that and do it well.
What I want to be sure is we have 20 minutes left, is that Eve shared with us her experience in building her practice. We were having dinner at the EMCC conference, and over dinner, she shared she has around 50 supervisees she's working with. So I am very curious about how she gets to build a practice where she's working with around 50 supervisees. Eve, I wanna hear more about that.
So I just realised I'd muted myself so I could listen. So I think one of the things that we're good at as coaches is to develop strong relationships and nurture them. And I think one of the things is to do that and to keep doing it. And I think with organisations, I've already mentioned that it's sometimes taken me a long time from first mentioning supervision or reflective practice and what it might do and how it can maintain standards, particularly within organisations. And I think the one I do a lot of work in now probably took me 3 years before they used me, but the message was the same, and I was not attached to them using me. It was just reinforcing why it was important. And the other thing is being seen, being heard, talking, presenting, using opportunities, because I would say that the majority of the supervisees I have been recommended to come to me. So once you get one, they recommend you to another, they recommend you to another. So, social media, I think, again, I know some of you are doing this really well. I mean, Lily's getting very well known. Damien, well, Damien, you're known by everybody. So, there's something about getting out there and speaking at conferences, speaking to groups of HR professionals, writing articles in leadership or leadership magazines, not just coaching magazines. So there's something, LinkedIn, it's this drip effect, because I think that's the evolution that's happened in the UK. It isn't one thing you can point to, it's a number of things that have happened bit by bit. So there are lots of different LinkedIn groups, contribute to all of them, start discussions on various subjects. I'm sure it's things you're doing, but I'm just saying what's been useful for me. And then I think, we'll say thinking virtual, it's great to be able to set up all sorts of things virtually. That could be virtual supervision groups. It could be virtual one-to-one. It could be with people in Europe, in Australia. Why couldn't you be supervising people in the UK, for example? So what's the differentiation that you have? Making those connections. With groups, I started by, well, first of all, Peter Hawkins challenged me to run groups because I said I was never going to. And he laughed at me. This is during my training, in a way that only he can. And I won't tell you the whole story, but I set myself a task. It was December, that by February I'd be running 2 groups. I was bonkers to do that, but I was. And first of all, I ran the groups and I didn't charge people because I was a new supervisor. So I set up 2 groups of 6 people in each group. And their only commitment was to give me feedback and to give me testimonials. And to this day, that was 7 years ago, I'm still supervising some of them, although I do encourage them to move on, because that's the other thing. I think sometimes it's best for people to not have a supervisor for too long. Working with internal and external coaches, I'm not sure how many internal coaches there are in America and in Canada and Latin America, but certainly there's a growth in the UK and in Europe to an extent of working with internal coaches. What's your charging policy? That's been a very interesting one for me, because I supervise people who other people won't because they can't afford to pay very much. My belief has always been that everyone should have access to supervision, and therefore if someone is working in a charity and is being paid very limited money as a coach, that's what I'm charging them as a supervisor. I know a lot of people who simply wouldn't charge as little as I do. But please don't feel sorry for me, because I'm earning very well and some people pay me a lot. So let me go back. What are your thoughts and any questions? Because I wanted to leave time for discussion.
From all of the social media that you used, what did you find the most, more results for you?
Wow. I think the ones that are most successful are the ones where people know me or know of me. So for example, when I was setting up supervision groups, one of the ones where I, in the initial stages, got people from was where I trained. So I trained in a particular place, which was Oxford Brookes University. And so when I put something there, they knew me and they would respond in that way. So I think there's something about people knowing you or can recommend you or know of you. And also in professional bodies, that was probably more successful. So I used those ones as well. Apart from that, I think it's been writing and just writing. Sometimes it's very short things and very simple things, but that's what I mean about being out there. because you don't have to write an article that's that big. You can write something that's one side of A4. So I've just put something on my website, which is one side of A4, which I wrote with Peter, which is 14 steps to build your coaching practice. You know, just simple things, little things.
This is, go ahead.
No, Pat.
Well, I was going to translate A4 to, at least to the US audience. That's a little bit longer than 8.5 by 11. And the other thing is, I would be interested in knowing what your trajectory was, because it sounded like you gave yourself this deadline from December to February. You started with 2 groups of 6, so that's 12, and now you're at 50. So what was the sort of trajectory that happened over those years?
Well, part of it is if you do training, which I know I know Damien does, because I know Damien a bit. So if you're doing some training, then you can end up obviously supervising the people you're training as coaches. So that, and what you tend to find is that if people start off and they really enjoy and benefit from the supervision, they will stick with the supervision in some way. So that was one way of doing it. So I still supervise people who are on training programs, although that's probably only about 6 or 7 people. Then I now supervise within, for example, a university. So again, I don't know what the university sector is like in the USA, Canada, Latin America, but where there's a lot of internal coaching tends to be universities, other public sector bodies, because money is so tight. They're more likely to use internal coaches than bring in external coaches. That may not be the same for you, but that's why there's such a growth market, because people are under such pressure in the public sector. So that's brought me another large number of coaches in groups. And then the one-to-one, what is interesting is partly it has been through, a couple have been through on a list with a professional body. So simply being an accredited supervisor, just being listed. So when people have looked for supervisors. But so much of that has been, I've supervised one person, they recommended me to 2 more. And then those 2 more have recommended me to others. And so that, I think it's about how you break into that initial one. Because I don't know if any of you have had that same experience, that once someone's enjoyed the supervision, they then recommend you on. I see Lily's nodding and Eva's nodding. So I think there's just something about developing relationships. What does anyone else think?
Yeah, I agree. It is about relationships. And I'm curious, Eve, which professional bodies you're referring to?
Well, I'm accredited with EMCC, as Damien knows, but I'm also accredited with a body in the UK called Apex, which Lillian, who can't be here today, Lillian Abrams, that's how I know her, because she's in Apex as well. And Apex is a very small professional body, but it's very highly thought of. And a lot of people look for supervisors there. There are only probably 20 accredited supervisors on the list. But of course, how are you going to get people to look for supervisors? I understand that's one of the challenge. What about anyone else's experiences? How have you all found supervisees?
I would
Your
like just to
supervisors.
point out, if I can. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Well, I think in Latin and Mexico and Latin America, even the concept of coaching, and it's still confusing for a lot of people, that they don't distinguish between other professions, and so going into mentoring and supervision, it's still in diapers. So we have a lot of work to do, and it's pretty new, everything here. So even investing in talent and everything, it's just building up. So that's a new challenge for this area.
Any other thoughts? You're all on mute, by the way. So
Well, I would say it's a referral business, just like coaching was in the early days. You have to get a toehold someplace, and so the suggestions that you've made about potentialities are really useful and good reminders. But it is one of those things that has to have a root and then sort of grow out from the roots, and that just does take time. But I would say if you can present at a chapter, if you can present at HR groups, sorts of things, with maybe a little exercise that you devise that gives a kind of a taste, an appetizer taste of what supervision is, that's a way into the idea of reflective practice.
And I think sometimes people can understand that what makes coaching great and what makes coaching great for our clients is often that ability to be able to simply take time out and think about what you're doing, standing back and think about what is it I'm doing, what do I need to do? Well, what are we modelling as coaches? And I think sometimes coaches get that concept that we need to model the same thing for ourselves, because otherwise we're doing it all the time, just like leaders are, but we're not reflecting on what we're doing. So I think people do see that as a parallel in my experience. But I do understand that it's not quite at the same mature stage.
There is one thing that's worked for me when I started out in 2009, which was when I was doing a sort of a reflective exercise. It was a positive reflective exercise. And, supervision is a place also where we celebrate and acknowledge success. And so if you can come up with something that's supervisorial in a reflective way that leads to a positive taste in their mouth, that's just maybe even more effective in terms of the scare factor about what supervision is. Because when we talk about blind spots, I remember that being I was a mature coach and it still gave me a little bit of a chill.
Yeah.
In public especially.
I think that's a really good reminder, because I think we're all aware as supervisors that there are three, in the literature, three main planks or legs of supervision. One being the qualitative, which is the more judging one, the normative one that you've talked about. And I think the challenge is that most people often only think of that when they think of supervision. Then if you really push them, they might think of development. So this idea of getting better, and as someone said, it's, sort of akin to when you're training. I think the one that everybody misses, and which will be in the book that I'm writing at the moment, is this whole area around resourcing as the third plank. It's where we go to be nourished as coaches, because I think coaching is a really challenging profession, and it can be emotionally very draining. It can be very challenging, difficult, lovely, wonderful. But where do we go? Peter Hawkins, I think Lily was on this call, said the difficulty is, if we're not careful, we'll all end up going to the petrol station when the tank in the car is at empty. And what we need to be doing is having a continual trip to the garage and being topped up, rather than getting to the point where we're almost completely depleted and got no energy left. And for me, I love supervision. I have 3 lots of supervision every month. And it's because I love the sense of what it does for me to keep me at my best and to keep me resourced and feeling healthy mentally and emotionally. And I think there's something, thank you, Pat, about emphasizing the nourishment that supervision brings, and not emphasizing the judgment, because that's not where I want to be as a supervisor. I want to be in partnership with my supervisees. I want us to work together collaboratively. Any other closing thoughts before we need to, I know we need to wind up. Okay, I think we'll thank you very much then. It's been fantastic to be with you all today, this morning. I hope there's something that will be useful from what we've talked about. I mean, I think you're doing a fantastic job, and it is really encouraging to see so many people who are working in your marketplace. And I think it will take time, but I think it will happen because there's the passion and enthusiasm.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Eve. I really appreciate that you took time. I know you've got lots of stuff going on your plate. You just touched a little on a few pieces. I know there's many more, and there's probably many more I don't know about as well. So I really appreciate your time. I'm totally grateful to you, and I'm really grateful to those that showed up in this space as well. And I'm really hoping we build this really robust community over here in the Americas. So thank you, everybody. We'll look forward to our next call. We don't know when that is, probably in June at some point.
Lily,
So
before we go, I want to make a comment for everyone, just to do a summary between Eve's session and Pat's session from last month, because I think that a couple of things that you shared today, Eve, is consistent with what Pat also shared last month when she talked about building her practice as the first supervisor in North America, in the United States. And just a point for everybody to reinforce is that we all, as a community that we're growing, we all need to work very hard here. We all have a lot of work to do. And the only way to build coaching supervision in North America and in the Americas is by the contribution of every one of us. So such as today, if you came to talk to us, I want to invite everyone, to the extent that you can, to do the same in your local markets. If everyone in your local city where you live can do a presentation for ICF or other association around what is coaching supervision and how it works, you not only bring consciousness about what is coaching supervision to the market, but also it's a way for you to market yourself. By being out there and people getting to know you, and by you maybe doing a demonstration, as Pat was saying before, I do believe that demonstrations will sell the idea better than just talking about it. And also investing some time in social media, in blogging, sharing something that can remind people about the coaching supervision. So just before we finish, Lily, I want to be sure that we all commit to do a little bit so we can all work together and grow this together.
Here, here.
Lily, you're on mute. You're on mute, Lily. You want to?
Thank you for that, Damien. That's a challenge out to the community. So we'll see you next time. Thanks so much. Have a great day, evening, wherever you are.
Thanks, everybody.